We go to the last round of questions.
I wanted to ask a question on the concept of sudden stop. I very well remember that you introduced this concept of sudden stop very earlier on, and you talked about in the context of a sudden stop of external capital, and now we are extending it to the domestic credit channel. But I think as far as the developing countries or the emerging countries are concerned, the credit crunch which came after the collapse of Lehman is an event which has to be distinguished from what happened before that. In fact, the subprime crisis started much earlier, and the emerging markets, the impact started in January 2008. There was a collapse of the capital market, and there was a foreign exchange crisis. Currencies were depreciating. And this all predates the Lehman incident of September 2008. And the sudden stop of the capital, which happened even earlier than Lehman, had impact in the emerging market economies. And then finally it led definitely to a stop of domestic credit. But that is an impact of something which happened earlier, and that is the effect of lack of confidence, which came much before the Lehman's breakdown. And that led to a collapse of demand, investment and consumption demand, and that led to collapse of domestic credit. So it is, the root is that way, not that the collapse of the credit led to the crisis, but collapse of demand led to drying of the credit. The banks did not give credit because there is no demand for credit.
Thank you. Thank you. Yes.
My name is Mustafa Mujiri from Bangladesh. I have a very simple question, do you think in terms of your analysis, there are any special implications for the poorest countries in the world which are more integrated in terms of the real sector channels, like exports and remittances, rather than the financial sector variables? Thank you.
Ahmed Galal from Egypt. Thank you, Professor Calvo, very much for a very thought-provoking presentation. I really did enjoy it. You make a very compelling case that the credit sudden stop is an important channel for transmitting the crisis, and it does have real impact on the real economy and employment. And we end up essentially with a call for strengthening the role of the lender of last resort. And the IMF becomes a hero. Even though I find the whole story very compelling, I really am a little troubled for two reasons. One, the micro side, the prevention mechanism, if you like. Is there anything that can be done about the credit market, the regulation of banks and non-banks, the shadow financial system? that can, well, of course, regulation is always problematic, but the lender of last resort is also problematic. And there are more hazards and everything else. So everything is problematic. So at least I need to worry about the origin of the problem to begin with. And that, I don't believe, has received enough attention in your presentation. The other part that kind of troubles me a little bit is when it comes to the kind of lack of institutional content of what would be taking place as the lender of last resort and IMF kind of functionality, as if we live in a vacuum. The fact of the matter is, I do believe that the world globalization of markets has really gone very far without the development of the corresponding global governance institutions. The G20 development is one element of the story, but is that good enough? I mean, how can I tell a whole story and then basically say very little about global governance issues as if the story is kind of mechanical in a way? Thank you.
The last question here, sorry, I mean, there are so many questions, but we have to wrap up with your question.
Thanks. It just follows this question, my question, which is maybe one way to think about it is to say what would have done lender of last resort through the crisis, given that a lot has been already been done. Or a different way to put it is, You say, well, people talk too much now back to regulation and so on. Those all wars. Okay? So let's talk of the new last war. But then the question is, what do you think is a credible lender of last resort? Because here in Europe, for example, we have Iceland, and that's exactly a problem of that. Iceland cannot deal with their problems. But the question is, if we had it, for example, with the ECB, had we left the thing growing as it grew? People saw this coming too. So at the end, you have to have some clear rules of how you behave. And this is something that's very confusing of the last crisis. I think we had avoided the depression, but there is a lot of confusion of when and why and how this lender of last resort, being a domestic or coordinated or a new institution, will act. So I'd like to have a word from you. Thanks.
Thank you. So, Guillermo,
Well,
you have the
thank
last
you very
word.
much for the questions. I'm glad that these questions have arisen because obviously I had just a short period of time to make these points, and I share your view that this is very complex. So I'm not trying to argue that with a lender of last resort you can solve all the problems or anything like that. So that's not the idea. It's rather to help start a discussion that we owe to ourselves. There are, let me see, let me address the first question on which my way of phrasing it would be, we are talking about credit sudden stops. Is that because of supply reasons or demand reasons? And I guess the first question was, look, before Lehman, we had countries being hit by a collapse in exports as a result of a fall in aggregate demand and collapse in advanced countries, in advanced economies, so that it was natural for individual units to borrow less, and that would be reflected in a collapse in a sudden stop, as I define it formally. And that's a valid point, absolutely. The issue of whether this is supply or demand is very central, and if we're going to do the analysis carefully, that should be addressed up front. In our analysis of this for international capital flows, that is available in the NBER collection, for example, we look at episodes where you can argue that the supply effect is important. And these are episodes where the EMBI, Emerging Market Bond Index, increased by more than 2 standard deviations. And many emerging markets are being hit at the same time. So there is an argument there that there is a phenomenon, and at that point for emerging markets, the advanced countries were growing, so the shock did not come from advanced countries. Different from now, certainly. So in that context, it was easy to isolate those episodes, call them sudden stops as supply, and so on and so forth. The rest of the analysis followed. Here, I agree with you that for emerging markets is more it's more of an issue, and the credit crunch aspect, I think I would put a special emphasis in regard to advanced economies. For emerging markets, there certainly was a cut in the shock, the initial shock for many emerging markets, and the poorest countries in particular, was through the export market. Now, an issue that will have to be analyzed more carefully. Remember that we don't define a credit crunch or a credit sudden stop as any fall in credit. is a fall in credit that is very, very unusual.